I'm your host, Tess Brigham. So let's make sense of the mess together. Today, my guest is Belle Walker. And Belle Walker is the kind of person who looks at organizational chaos and sees blueprints. With an engineering sciences degree from Harvard and a master's in systems architecting and engineering from USC, she builds the structures and processes that help companies actually work the way they're supposed to. Through her firm, Bellevue Consulting, she helps leaders cut through the noise, design systems that scale, and turn groups of rock stars into real teams. Thank you so much for being here, Belle.
Thank you, Tess. I'm super excited for this conversation, cleaning up the
So,
mess at least a little.
so let's start. I want to hear your because I don't think I really know your origin story. How do you go from Harvard grad engineering sciences to building systems for organizations?
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it honestly starts pre-college because I'm a little bit of an accidental engineer.
Mm,
So my whole family, like the last 2 or 3 or 4 generations, were all engineers. And so it kind of didn't occur to me that I could study anything other than engineering, which is such a kind of ridiculous thing to say, right? I obviously knew that there were a million other majors out there, but it just hadn't really internalized that I could study something other than engineering, or at least not as anything other than a dual major.
hmm
And so um, I think if I'd been born into almost any other family, I would have been very solidly in the humanities, trying to figure out
mm.
something on that path. And so in college, I actually spent about 40 hours a week stage managing. Um, and
Really?
yeah, so
Wow.
very much in the arts. In high school, I ended up doubling English and history for a couple of years.
hmm
So I've always had a much more humans focused kind of nature.
hmm
And then I layered all these engineering skills on top of it. And so when I was looking for my first job out of school, I kind of stumbled into this role at Google where I got to build an aerial photography operation, which was super cool, super fun, and really hammered home that building teams, building org structures, building operations, you can approach it as an engineering problem.
hmm
That engineering problem solving is not a mystery. It's really about zeroing in on what is the problem you're trying to solve. What are the constraints that you're working under? What are the resources you have available? And if you really know those three things, there's usually only so many answers you can come up with
hmm
to play around with. And so bringing that approach into all sorts of different contexts works pretty well. And I got that very clearly at Google. And so went back to grad school to get a little more theory, especially on the systems engineering side, because that's all about how do you take black boxes, which includes other people's brains, and
hmm
figure out how you can fit them together so that they work well. So I really liked that. I didn't see anyone else talking about organizations through this lens.
hmm
Started the consulting company right out of grad school, promptly got cold feet, which was, I think, a very wise
hmm
plan because I didn't have the experience really at that point I think, to be an effective consultant. So I spent the
hmm
next, most of a decade working for companies, building teams, actually doing the things that
Yeah.
I thought would work in theory. And then I ended up taking that into consulting in 2019. So
Got
that's
it.
my origin
Okay.
story.
Yes. Well, that's so interesting. So anybody in your family not an engineer? Did
My
anyone rebel?
sister now, but she's
Oh.
7 years younger. So she was the one who finally was, and she actually started as an engineer in college and went to her
Mm.
first internship and spent all day, working with engineers, and came back and said nope, and completely revised
Wow.
her degree plan. Yeah.
So what did she switch it to?
So now she's an archivist, but
Oh,
she actually switched her major to be effectively a history of science and engineering
got
approach. So
it.
she's very interested by the concepts and the preservation
Mm.
element, but not necessarily the doing.
Yes, got it. Okay. Well, everyone in your family must be geniuses because I'm thinking to myself, I could never be an engineer. Thank God that wasn't the path for my family because it wouldn't,
It,
I'm constantly amazed.
I mean, I think it's different skill sets, right? Like
Mhm.
there's an element of genius. I don't know. I guess I struggle a little bit with that concept. I don't know. I'm late to the game here, right? There's a lot of critiques of IQ, et cetera, as a
Uh-huh.
concept. But I think that really there are some people that are stronger and less strong with math and that piece of
Mhm.
it, but that doesn't speak to innate genius, if that makes
Mm.
sense. So
Yeah.
we've got good
So
math skills.
so but wait, what you're if I'm understanding it, it's that engineering isn't just, I think, right, my assumption was engineering is just knowing math and being able to fit these things, but you're saying no, engineering is you have to be good at math, but you also there's all these other things that laymen like myself don't quite understand
Exactly.
how
Yeah, I think
intricate it
that
is.
problem solving skill
Mhm.
set, right? That's really what most of the study is about is
Mhm.
really how do you even set up these problems? Because once you have the problem set up correctly, then the math just kind of follows, right?
Mm.
That's one nice thing about engineering math, right? If you get into pure math, then you get into sort of all sorts of wonky directions where there are options, even though it's math. But
Yeah.
if you're in an engineering context, the equations, the formulas tend to be fairly straightforward. There's less variability. What's hard, the challenge I think is really around knowing what math to do when.
Mhm.
And so that's the part of the skill set that I have found most helpful and have carried forward, which is
Mhm.
why I'm so fixated on it.
So, was there a moment? I mean, do you have a moment in your career as you look back where you're like, "Oh, wait, this is I see this. This is chaos. I can fix it. I can make sense of it?" Or was it really a gradual thing?
Oh, that is a good prompt for me to think on a little bit. I think there's definitely a clear through line, but I don't think there was a moment.
Mhm.
I the last job that I worked full time for someone else, I was working on maps for autonomous vehicles,
Mm.
and specifically on quality and
Mhm.
what quality means in that context was a very active point of discussion. There
Mm.
was so at the most base level, there is a world, and a map is supposed to reflect that world. And so, how correctly the map reflects the world is you would think is quality. And yet,
Mhm.
to really break it down, there's all sorts of different elements you can look at to measure. Because if you knew exactly what the world was already, then you would already
Mhm.
have your perfect map. So you have to deal with the fact that your theory and your reality are never going to fully come together, right? So, like, if I knew exactly what correct was to be able
Mhm.
to measure the correctness of my map, I would already have a correct map.
Yes.
And so, you need some sort of proxy. So, different things you can use are like timeliness, right? How recently was the map checked or refreshed or updated? Or you can look
Mhm.
at, um, how pinpoint accurate does the map, so if I know there's a stop sign here, right,
Mhm.
does it matter if it's 10 feet off or 30 feet off? And that tends to
Mm.
depend on how the map is being used. And so digging in on all those questions, again, what is the problem you're trying to solve,
Yeah.
in great detail? What are the resources you have? What are the constraints you're working with? And um, that was the role where I started to realize that a lot of what I enjoy is not just solving those problems, but finding ways to communicate about them that allow everyone to enter the conversation. So,
Mm.
um, in that situation, I was working with a lot of automobile manufacturers who are trying to make highly automated cars. So not fully autonomous at that point, but fairly autonomous. And
Mhm.
they had one view of the map that basically boiled down to a perfectly correct representation of the world,
Mhm.
which we already said no,
Yeah.
not how that works. And the people making the map had, I think, this view of how the automated vehicles were going to work that basically looked a lot like the kind of user infotainment systems that had always been there. And so bridging that gap and helping the map makers understand how the automated vehicles were thinking about the map, and
Mm.
vice versa, helping the automobile manufacturers figure out what was a safe and practical way to think about the map, was something I really enjoyed.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Actually, you and I do something very similar. There's just less math. There's no math involved in mine. But yeah, it's the same. Same idea. So then, because when I was thinking about this interview, this was the question that I really had for you. And if you don't have an answer, it's fine. But it's really around, like, we live in this really messy world. It is so chaotic right now and loud, like loud, just stuff coming at you constantly. I mean, how, when you think about and you apply what you know, how do you make sense of the world today?
Yeah, some of it is, just straight up minimizing how much
Yeah.
I'm listening to because overwhelm and overload, and some of it is a certain degree of abstraction,
Mm,
um, in the sense that I think, and trying to figure out how to phrase this
mhm,
best. This for me taps into the sort of systems engineering side
mhm,
where there's just a certain degree of detail and nuance that becomes overwhelming,
mm,
versus necessary. And so
mhm,
when I talk about systems engineering, I often use satellites as examples,
mhm,
partly because that's what my husband works on, and partly because it again it's something that most people kind of have a concept of. A satellite is a thing that is up in space, and once
mhm,
it's there, you're not touching it, right? you can
mhm,
you can talk to it nominally, but you cannot go in and move a wire or tighten a screw or anything like that.
mhm,
So it's kind of a standalone system, and the power that you need that you can get is constrained. The amount of
mhm,
fuel that you have is limited, and so all these pieces of a satellite have to work together without any sort of more inputs coming in once you launch. And so in a aerospace satellite context, a lot of what the systems engineering role is to say there's all these pieces of a satellite and there's a fixed amount of resources.
mhm,
How do we make it work? So
mm,
power budget is kind of a great example. Satellites literally have a power budget. There's a certain amount of power
mhm,
that you're going to be able to generate, and there's a propulsion system, there's a star tracking system, there's whatever the heck the satellite is there to do, the instruments, all of
mhm,
those pieces, they all need power. And so, how much of it do each of them get? What comes in? What comes out? How does that all balance? And if you have too much power, you have to get rid of it as heat because
mm,
there's nowhere. If you have too much, too much, too much power, it just builds
yeah,
up and it doesn't go anywhere, which is also a problem. Uh, so, you really do have to find a balance there. And you can't get too far into the weeds of what each of those systems is doing. You need to know the power in and or the
mhm,
power out and
mhm,
bring all those pieces together. And there's no way I think one person is going to understand every nuance of every piece of every, of some of the larger
mhm,
satellites that are out there. So it's changed a little bit with the small sats, but the sort of traditional big satellites,
uh-huh,
but you can absolutely say these are the 10 or 15 systems on this satellite. These are the power needs of these 10 or 15 systems. This is the
uh-huh,
power generation capacity. And that sort of approach and mentality is often what I try to bring to bear on the world in general.
mhm,
There's so much noise there, but what is the information that I actually need,
mhm,
right? And so to pick, um, an example where I know nothing, right?
mhm,
The healthcare system.
mhm,
You probably know a lot more about it, some of the nuances,
mhm,
etc. I really care, what goes in and
mhm,
what comes out.
yeah,
And I know darn well that I have no good ideas for how you fix what's happening in the middle. I trust that there are other people who have those ideas who will
mhm,
work on figuring it out. But what I can fixate on or listen to is the inputs and the outputs, and that helps tamp it down. For me, it's really picking which pieces I care about, and the handful of things where I do want to go deep and know what's happening in
yeah.
between.
Yeah, our jobs are very similar. The more we talk, when we dig into this, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is because it's really what you're speaking to. It is the skill set that you have and what you're doing has got very little to do with whatever the problem really is. That it's
Yes.
really about, and it's the same way with therapists, right? It's not the person and their background. You're trained to, empathize and understand and put yourself, and try to see things the way they do. But at the end of the day, it's you're just dealing with people. And so
Mhm.
how do people operate? How do people work? What's going to make sense? All of those kinds of things. Absolutely. You brought up something that was really interesting about energy, and a friend of mine, she always talks about this, about the way we write with productivity. We measure everything on, I'm going to do this at this hour, and then this, right? And I do believe in scheduling and time blocking and all of those things, but one factor that we don't take in enough, that I'm always trying to get my clients to see, is we don't take in our energy levels. Right?
Mhm.
That whole thing about you do the hardest thing first, and there's a reason for that, because that's when you're at your peak.
Yep.
Your day gets more chaotic as it goes along. There are more chances for things to fall apart. But there is that piece of the energy, right? If your energy is low, you cannot have that same output. And so a lot of that is what you're talking about. Like, even the machines that we see is like go, 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 right? But if you have too many apps on your phone's going to slog and be slow. And it sounds like that's right, similar to what happens with satellites when there's too much energy. It's not
Yeah.
helpful. I think people think, "Oh, more, 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 you need this or getting more done." It's like, no, that's not really always what's best, because it'll burn you out,
So I
essentially.
actually
Yeah.
wrote an article in 2024,
Mm.
about in April 2024, thinking about return to office policies and energy
Mhm.
budgets, right? Very
Oh, yeah.
specifically, because what I was seeing at that point was a lot of companies putting policies into place that were strangely disconnected from what they were trying to accomplish.
Mhm.
Um, and so they they would say, we want everyone back in the office, and you would say, well, why do you want folks back in the office? Oh, we want more in-person collaboration,
Mhm.
particularly between people on different teams. Okay, fair, valid. And then they would put a policy and that would say something like, you have to be in the office 2 days a week, and that would be the full guidance. And then their teams would sit down and connect, and they would coordinate to all be in the office together. And then none, the teams that they needed to talk to each other were in the office on different days, and
Mm.
people were cranky about being in the office, and they weren't getting what the leadership had been hoping to
Yeah.
get out of it anyway. So um, one of the things that I've been trying to get leaders to do for a long time is, if you're going to put a return to office policy in place, or have a guideline around how and when people are in the office, start with what you want to get out of it,
Mhm.
right? And back out from there. And one lever that I think is really helpful is thinking about what is easier in person and what is easier remote, and where how do you optimize the energy of your teams. And
Mhm.
so in the article, I was looking specifically at the energy for commute and the energy for training, um,
Mm.
because because oversimplifying the problem helps make it more communicable. But if you have a lot of people with long commutes, right, that takes
Mhm.
a ton of time and
Mhm.
energy. And one of the hardest things to do, I think, remotely, is really effective mentoring and training and development. And
Mhm.
so if you are a company that tends to hire more experienced people, right? Maybe every now and then you have somebody who's new to the workforce, but in
Mhm.
general, you're hiring experienced people and you're mostly getting them up to speed on how your business works. That's
Mhm.
one thing. If you are constantly bringing in a wave of new grads, new hires that are how to be in the professional world, that can be very, very difficult to communicate and interact over Zoom. So, in the first situation, doing more remote work so that your teams don't have to commute probably is a better energy
Mhm.
balance, right? You're not having to up your energy to do all this training. You get to save your energy on the commute. Whereas if
Mhm.
you have a ton of these, folks that need a lot of mentoring pretty much perpetually, right? Because there's just a new wave coming in every year.
Mhm.
Having that energy go down because everyone is in the office, it's much lower barrier to asking those questions, et cetera, on a very steady basis, that can counteract that additional energy that people are putting into their commute.
Mhm.
And so
That's so interesting.
yeah.
I love the way it's so fascinating. So this actually is a good segue to, what are you seeing? You don't have to talk specifics, but like, generally, are you seeing that the with this younger generation, with Gen Zs entering the workforce, is this a conversation that you're having more and more and more?
Um, I would say yes and no.
Mhm.
So it took me. a very long time, I would say up until the last like 2 years, to be willing to engage with the notion that generations are different.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
because people are people,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
and I stand by, I don't think there are innate differences in the sort of personhood of someone from
Mhm.
different generations. What finally like drove it home into my head was, I think it was a podcast that was talking about how formative, right, the different experiences are,
Mhm. Yes.
thinking about what it is to go through the Great Depression versus, coming out of college.
The
I'm the
pandemic.
oldest. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm the oldest of four kids, and there's an eight graduation year spread, actually 9 graduation year spread between when I graduated college and when my sister graduated college, and all
Mhm.
four of us had very different experiences
Mhm.
about when we entered the workforce, and so that I think has been flipping that
Yeah.
switch has made a big difference, and so I think right coming out after the pandemic has made a big difference.
Mhm.
And so, that said, one of the reasons that I came at it with that attitude is because I am an elder millennial. And I think a lot of what I saw millennials doing that annoyed the older generations when we came into the workforce was asking for what we wanted.
Yes.
And a lot of what I
Crazy concept, people. Crazy
crazy
concept.
concept, right?
What? How dare you?
And that a lot of what the Gen Xers, the Boomers, they didn't disagree. They wanted the same things. What they were annoyed about was the fact that we were asking, and that
Yes.
for me was very much like, my sympathy is somewhat limited, right? You had to suffer because the system was terrible does not mean we have to suffer because
Yes.
the system is terrible.
Mhm.
And so that anyway, but I think there are I think that trend has continued, basically,
Mhm.
that each new generation has felt more willing and able to ask for what they want, and
Mhm.
what they want has shifted.
Yes.
And Gen Zers in particular, what I have seen is that they, that we sort of as the older generations spent their entire childhood basically telling them, you are the future, your job is to come up and fix everything, you're going to have to do climate change, you're the leaders of tomorrow, like you need to be ready to step up and take on the world. And
Mhm.
then they graduated college and we were like, welcome to the workforce, you are now the lowest peg in the, you're on the lowest rung, now
Mhm.
we would like you to just sit down and wait until your time. And
Yes.
I can't imagine what that would be like, right? To be told like you need to get in and get moving, and your whole youth is about coming in and being a leader, and then being told we don't
Mhm.
want you to lead anything. Like, of course that's causing conflict and stress and challenge. And so that's one of the things that I've tried to work with my clients on, is how do you tap into that
Mhm.
sort of innate motivation and potential and this desire. And there is a reality of perspective, right?
Mhm.
I, as an executive, could have and could still use myself as a consultant, right? There's something about being
Mhm.
in the day to day versus being outside the day to day, where the exact same person, skill set, everything will bring something different to the table.
Mhm.
And so with that in mind, I think there's just a certain degree of experience being in a business, being in a field, and you learn more, you continue
Mhm.
to learn, and there are just different perspectives and challenges. And as you're coming up through an organization, you think you know everything because you know everything you can see, right? It's
Yes.
the I'm just going to get into cliches where you can't see what you can't see, and that
Mhm.
makes it very difficult. And so a lot of my clients, what I try to work with them on is helping to expose the bigger picture,
Mhm.
while also asking them to lean on their younger employees who want to step up and lead,
Mhm.
to find ways to lead within their context.
Yes.
Where I see the biggest conflict is where the younger folks want to step in and lead at a bigger scope and scale than they have the context for. And so that's why I feel like
Mhm.
it's helpful to expose the broader context and kind of say, look, there are hints of things that are beyond what you can see that are influencing directions and decisions. And we want to know where you're going to take us and where you can lead us within what you can see.
Yes. No, I absolutely agree with you in terms of, I think when people think about the generations, they're assuming that when we talk about it, that we're just saying, all this group is entitled and lazy, and this group is like this, and this group's like that. And it's like, no, listen, every new generation is considered entitled and lazy. So that's across the board, no matter who you are. But yeah, there are lazy people in every single generation from going back to the beginning of time. But yeah, the events of your life, and I think especially in the world that we live in today, with the technology moving so rapidly, I mean, the tech that you had is radically different than the tech this Gen Z has. I mean, and just all of it. I went to college, I had a word processor, right? Just how things were moving faster and faster and faster. But it's interesting when you talk about young people coming in for leadership, because it's interesting, because I remember as a Gen Xer that it was like you wanted to lead, but you wouldn't ask. It was on you to figure out ways in which to find ways to lead. And maybe it won't necessarily, if you're an ambitious person, it might not necessarily be at work, but you're always thinking about that. I think when millennials came in, what I saw was a lot of them coming in going, okay, I'd like to lead. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and that all these other generations were like, wait a second, we're not supposed to ask that. And what I love about Gen Z is they're coming in going, no, you need to think about my career and work with me and help me and do all this stuff, or I won't be here. Like,
Right.
I'm just not going to be here. And the thing is that, we're all struggling in different ways when we look at that of, is that entitlement? And I think lots of people who have these perspectives will say yes, and people over here will say no. And but for the most part, it's like, I think as a culture, we have to get to a point of asking for what you want and need should not be seen as entitled.
I completely agree with that, and I also want to come back a little bit to what
Hmm.
you were saying with how quickly the technology
Yes.
is evolving, and and this is again going to be an area where you know more than I do, but there is a certain degree of adaptability in
Hmm.
younger brains that I think is there's like elasticity, and this is like neuroscience
Yeah.
levels of how brains work. And so, my grandfather is still doing research in chip design. So I'm coming at this from a very deep belief that you don't have to be young to be innovative.
Hmm. Hmm.
And if I need help with something on my phone, I'm going to look for somebody who looks younger than me, not somebody who looks older than me, right? Like that.
Yes.
And so this is actually, I just talked about this in my LinkedIn newsletter last week. This whole move towards replacing entry level jobs with AI
Hmm.
strikes me as just one of the most self defeating moves I have seen maybe in my entire career.
Hmm.
Um, it reminds me of 2008 when a lot of the tech companies started doing layoffs because there might be a recession. And it was just
Hmm.
this self fulfilling prophecy that I felt like in real time you could just look at it and say, like, what? And I'm having that like what moment again with how a lot of companies are thinking about entry level jobs. For two reasons. One, or three reasons. One, because, and this is not related to people, just the fact that the way that AI is changing, I don't think it's going to make sense to think of sort of seniority and progression the way we have historically. Everything we have in the
Yes.
job ladder is based on humans. AI is just different. And I think we need to
Hmm.
rethink a lot of how we're structuring roles, responsibilities, sort of from the beginning. But that's less relevant here, right? Here in this context, I think one piece of it is if you don't hire folks at the entry level, where do your senior people come from
Hmm.
down the line? And I've seen quite a few people talking about where do your managers come from, and
Hmm.
that is a very good question. But it completely overlooks the fact that the vast majority of people in the workforce are not managers. That doesn't stop them from being senior. And so
Hmm.
these senior individual contributors are to a large extent what keep the wheels turning in most organizations. And how do they come into being if you're not creating entry level roles and giving people an early foundation. So that's sort of piece two. But the third one
Mm-hmm.
is all of this revolution is happening because of a change in technology. If you want your organization to adapt and evolve and grow with a new technology, why on earth are you closing out the subset of people that are stereotypically and generally more likely to be
Mm-hmm.
adopted and adapting?
Yeah.
I also don't want to promote ageism here, right? There's really a balance to be had, and find that balance, right?
Mm-hmm.
This wholesale sweeping, just like cut the pyramid off at the bottom level, just seems short-sighted and bonkers to me,
Yeah.
to use a technical term.
Yeah, I agree with you, this whole AI thing and the AI panic. And it feels, I guess my thought was, I wonder, we're we're always looking for the band-aid. We're always looking for the thing. And I feel like a lot of companies or way maybe AI companies, this is how they're selling it to people, which is we can replace. Look, you don't want to hire, you don't have to hire new people, you don't have to do this, you don't have to do that, you can replace it. And so everyone's like, oh great, thinking that that's the solution. But from what I've heard from people, especially people that work in the do career coaching and that kind of thing, that what they're really talking to their young people about is that you need to understand AI, you are still needed, but that
Mm-hmm.
jobs may require new people coming in to have an understanding of AI and how to use it. And I think it feels like just like computers or the internet or anything else that we
Right.
did along the way, which is like, this isn't going to replace everything, but it is there to help and streamline some things. But it's not going to just, but it's so weird how we just decide, like, well, it'll just take over jobs, right? Anything to avoid dealing with people. It's this crazy thing,
Yeah.
you know? Like we
Well,
spend a lot
and
of time trying not to deal with people, yet we're still people.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and circling back to the sort of the very beginning of the conversation and talking about kind of zones of genius, et cetera,
Hmm.
one of the most common things people talk about using AI for is writing of various forms.
Yes.
And I have a website, right? I put out a fair number of written pieces. There, some of the thought leadership stuff I do is very self-indulgent, right? I write it
Hmm.
because I care about it. I want to work through the process. That's what it's there for. My website, I would like people to look at it and want to hire me, right? This
Yeah.
is not being promotional. This is what websites are there for. And there's a lot of literature out there. How do you write so that it's compelling? How do you speak to people's problems? How do you, like, there's so many guidelines. I have read them all. I can't do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've done it. And then people who actually know what they're talking about say, no, you need to change these like tiny little things.
Yeah.
It makes a big difference. And so if I use AI, I am in the exact same challenge of I think I've done it. I think the AI has done it. I don't have the expertise to know what is good.
Yes. That's a great way of
And
putting it.
so
Yeah.
leaning on the AI to not only produce what I need, but to know whether it's good, that's where I think the biggest pitfalls are for a lot of people and a lot of AI use. And so, my general rule of thumb is if I can't recognize good, I need to hire
Mm.
an expert to use the AI.
Oh, that's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Because I mean, and we're already seeing this with AI already with, the whole big thing was like, oh, there's this, now there's an AI therapist and, shouldn't you be scared? And I'm like, I was never scared. And then now you see, I mean, it's very tragic. The kid that took his own life, and because the AI could not recognize, like, they must have fed it at some point. This is the part I don't quite get, but like, there are these, things that you look for if you're worried about someone harming themselves. And it must have been one of those things where whatever the kid phrased was never a word or anything in there that alarmed the AI. And that's something, again, right? How we speak about things, there's so much more to that. There's the way in which we say it, how we say it with our face, all of those things that they can't pick
Yeah.
up. So I don't worry about AI the way other I use it, and I think I use it in the best way that I can. And then and then I always tweak it, like, based on what I know, based on what feels right to me. I think it's a great resource. It just makes me crazy that we taking a step back and looking at it. Well, let's look, how does this all fit together?
Yeah.
No.
And I think that sometimes serves us well,
Yes.
because sometimes there are problems that need to be addressed. And more generally, right, that high anxiety level can prevent us from thinking clearly about what we need to engage with. And
Mhm.
that also is part of why I talk about perspective a lot,
Yes.
right? When
Mhm.
when I'm working with organizations to help, my tagline is taking organizations from friction to function, right? If
Mhm.
you're in the middle of that friction and just trying to get something done or engage and think through, it's really hard to focus on these pain points, because almost always the result is that there's a constant stream of tiny fires or large fires that need to be put out now, right? And
Mhm.
so asking someone to stop putting out bundles of kindling when all the ones they put out before are on fire right now is
Mhm.
very difficult. And I
Mhm.
think that's part of why it's so helpful to have folks that can look at it from the outside and say, all right, put out that fire, and then let's get rid of this bundle of kindling. Let's
Yes.
put out those three fires and get rid of this bundle. And that you can kind of start to find that balance, but you have to find that balance, and you can't ask someone to ignore the fires. That's
Yes.
not practical either.
So, do you feel like, is that the biggest sort of mistake that leaders make when it comes to, right? What's an example of the friction that leaders don't see that costs them big in different ways?
Yeah, so the kind of friction that I deal with, so I actually made a comment earlier saying about, a person's head is like a black box, and that can be
Mhm.
in systems engineering. And that is actually something that I have very much evolved away from. What I've realized, the kind of work I do is not super effective when it's two humans that have friction and conflict. That
Mm.
gets way more into the sort of psychology, what I
Yeah.
think of as the hearts and minds piece of it. I'm looking at functions, when functions have friction, which
Mhm.
can manifest as two people, but it's so examples of when I talk about functions having friction, security and usability
Mm.
are always in tension. Do you like two-factor authentication? No,
Mhm.
no, nobody likes two-factor authentication. And until there are better systems available to that, that is one of the best systems we have for adding a
Mhm.
little bit of security. So that's an example of functional tension that can look like friction between two people if your head of security and your head of usability are fighting about it.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, that's at where I think a lot of leaders make a mistake is they think they have to fix the problem now or never.
Mm.
And in their defense, it is really, really hard to work on a solution that's going to take 6 to 12 months, or maybe a little shorter, maybe a little longer, that for their future selves, for their future
Mhm.
business. Um, and it's very hard to do without outside support, whether that's an executive coach or a consultant like me or someone.
Mhm.
And so they tend to think, I don't have the capacity to fix this right now, and they often don't. And then they either think, well, I'll never have the capacity to fix it, or I will have the capacity at this time in the future. And the reality is,
Yes.
you
Oh, yeah.
probably never have that capacity. You need to, whether it's someone internally where this is their job that they're being measured against, or someone externally that you bring in, it has to be someone's job, responsibility,
Mm.
area to drive that long-term change. And I think
Mhm.
that's what's so hard for a lot of leaders, is to say, I'm going to put this important piece of my company's future, at all in the hands of someone else. And so, no, you're not. What you're doing is asking them to help you actually keep that moving forward in parallel, while you're dealing with all your day to day that, yeah, does need
Mhm.
to happen.
Well, and the other thing too is you're speaking to how change takes time. Change takes I mean, and and it's very hard to right you can change without a therapist, a coach, a consultant. You can, but it is
Mhm.
much harder. And um and at the same time, even if you are working at this high capacity, putting in all the hours, it's still going to take time. I think that's the other part of it that people don't quite get, because people, it's patience. It's the same for parenting, right? There's always these little fires and things. You got to deal with this, your life, blah blah blah. But then there are sometimes these things going on with your kid in the background that you're kind of like, oh crap, oh, and
Yeah.
I and that's why parenting's such a hard job, and why you we've got to give any parent a lot of grace, because it is a lot to juggle. It is a lot to see, but it seems like a common theme where,
Yeah, it
yeah.
it it ties back to one of my pet peeves about language and reality, which is that no matter how long something takes, in retrospect, it's a sentence, right?
Mm.
So, it took me 2 hours to fix that. It took me 2 years to fix that, right? These are almost exactly the same sentence, like, they evoke a little bit of a different emotion, but honestly
Hmm.
not really, and it's
Mm.
something that I'm very cognizant of in reading a lot of parenting books.
Yes.
They will often say, the case studies and this wonderful, you know, change that was wrought by following whatever guidance or this book is proposing. The case studies will be things like, and then we did this, and within 3 weeks we started to
Mm.
see improvement. And when
Yes.
you say it like that, it sounds so short, and then you imagine living 3 more weeks with whatever nightmare scenario you started at. And like, yes, it will get better, but not immediately. And maybe by 2 weeks it felt a little better, and by 3 weeks it was great.
Hmm.
And that's like the best case scenario. Often it's within 3 months we got this kind
Yeah.
of change. And you know, it I don't have a good answer, right? It's
Yeah.
hard to write a you don't really want to be in your book and be like 3 months. Yeah, it was a really tough 3 months. Yes, it really sucked. Yes, it will be hard. Yes, you'll want to quit. Like, that's not a good book. But that's the reality.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true, because we both written books, right? And when you write something out, you want your example to make sense. And so, right, so we're sort of catering things. I think a lot of times with books we're catering things.
Mhm.
But the other part of it too is, yeah, I mean, I'm talking about working with a client maybe a year, 2 years, longer, whatever it is. And it takes time. Even when I talk about my own story of going through a quarter life crisis, I try to explain to people it wasn't like I had this crisis in the next moment, like everything worked. It was like several years of
Yeah.
like kind of figuring it out, and then another like 8 years of figuring out what it was within therapy and coaching and all that I want to do, and then another 10 to like get really good at it. And so all of those things, um they're never as they are illustrated in
Right.
TV and movies and books. So that's the big, I think, again, when you're growing up, that's your reference point for all of these things. I think it's the other thing about young people entering the workforce. It's like, yeah, they don't have a lot of reference points. Like they really don't know what it's like to get up and go to work every day for for years and years and years. Like they're used to 2 weeks off at the holidays or a month or whatever. So yeah, it's going to be an adjustment for
Yeah.
sure. And I think that was a thing. When I entered the workforce, it was like that shocked me, but we weren't supposed to talk about it. We weren't supposed to do that.
Mhm.
And I think what we're seeing now are these generations, especially are going, well, this is really hard. And we hear them speaking about things, right? And we assume like, oh, they're ungrateful. Oh, they're this or they're that. And it's like, no, they're kind of just talking out loud,
Yeah.
and kids do that too. They
Yeah.
talk about things out loud and just like they're just thinking it through. It doesn't the whole thing's
My
gonna
son
fall
is
apart.
3.5, and he likes to tell me I'm a bad guy. You're being a
For
bad guy when I'm
oh
asking him to, do
yeah,
anything he doesn't want to do.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Because yeah, who wants to do things you don't want to do?
Yeah.
Completely reasonable.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier about being an elder millennial, and I'm curious because one thing that I think is, especially for elder millennials, that this has been rough. I really, I've worked with lots of clients that graduated in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, their career and the way they dealt with their career was very different than how someone who graduated in 2015 had to deal with their career. So there's that piece of like, you all worked really, really hard to go to these institutions and paid all this money and put in all this time to then find out, oh, I can't work. Like I can't get a job. And then the other thing I thought was it seemed like a lot of the elder millennials had young kids during COVID. And I really felt for people that had young kids during COVID, like 2, 3, 4, those that young kids that age, because it's very different having my son was like 12 or 13. It's very different.
Yeah, and I will say I have like walked this golden line that I'm very cognizant
Mhm.
of. So you said you worked with a lot of clients. I graduated
Mhm.
7, 8. I graduated '06, and that is a very meaningful difference, right? My
Mhm.
experience versus the people literally 1 year behind me,
Mhm.
very different.
Yeah.
And so I was able to get into the workforce. I did go back to grad school in 2010. And that, I really wanted to go to grad school. Like I did not job hunt at that point. I was
Mhm.
specifically leaving to go back to school, but I was nervous about whether there would be jobs coming out the far side. And
Mhm.
fortunately, by 2012, the workforce looked a little different. But my next younger brother, he actually graduated in 2010, I
Mm.
believe, and uh, spent 2 years job hunting. And he also he actually ended up going back to grad school in 2012. And he said within the first 3 months of his grad school program, he started getting all these emails from companies that he had sent his resume to
Oh.
in the last 2 years, right? Like it's literally he had worked so hard to try and get a job and so hard and then stopped trying
Mhm.
entirely, and then the world just, and so that I think was very sort of illustrative for me, like, oh,
Yeah.
I this is not about me. This is a much bigger global trend. Yeah, and then we waited a long time to have kids, and so my son, my oldest, was born in 2022, and early in 2022, but he was able to start going to a daycare program,
Mhm.
very young. But so many of my friends had kids at home, and having a toddler and a baby now, I can't imagine, right,
Yeah.
how you work with them in the house.
Mhm.
It's there there is I think a necessary shift in mentality when you have kids and how you think about your career.
Mhm.
I before I had kids, I had a husband for 7 years before we had kids, and I did like to spend time with him and wanted to have that be a part of my life. But I could work a 60-hour week, no
Yeah.
problem, and have plenty of time for hanging out with him and running and doing the things I wanted to do. So what's put it really into perspective for me is he is I think he's taking a sabbatical. He thinks he's retired. We'll find out one day. Y'all can check in and see who's right. Um, but when I really stepped back and looked at his commitments, he is going to be busier and more heavily committed, substantially busier and more heavily committed as a father who does not have a full-time job than he was as an employee
Mhm.
working 60 plus hour
Oh, yeah.
weeks.
Work's
Um,
easier. Anybody who has kids knows work is so much easier than raising your kids. I mean,
Right. Well, I was thinking of it as like, oh, think how much free time he'll have. And I was like,
yeah.
no, he actually had more free time before we had kids than he has right now, not not having a full-time job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
Like,
yeah. I mean, anytime I saw someone who just got back from maternity leave, I mean, they were just like, "Oh my god, I'm having coffee by myself." Just like how and those small things, you really don't recognize how enjoyable they
right.
are until you get there.
And
Yeah.
and so when you bring that much commitment into your life, it has to change how you think about
Mhm.
your professional work. Not necessarily that you have to do anything differently, but all of the consequences and the implications change. And
Mhm.
so it is, I think, inevitable, and this is for parents of all genders at this point, because we've moved away from purely expecting women to bond with
Mhm.
their children, right? I think there
Yeah.
is a very real expectation. And I'm starting to see, especially with elder millennials, I think, and especially with those who had the kids home during COVID, right? Those much
Mhm.
stronger bonds with all parents. And then the mom guilt now is just parent guilt, right? And
Yeah.
so we're not actually winning out of this.
So we've gone way over time here,
Oh,
but
yes.
it's
Whoops.
so fascinating. But I would love to, just before we wrap up, what would be the way you would clean up the gen mess? Or, I mean, I know mess, people kind of get a little like, well, is it really a mess? And it's like, I, I, I think with what I see with technology and how things are quickly changing. I do think we're going to continue to have these issues until we start to figure them out or look at them differently. But you may have a different idea.
No, I think I'm going to come right back to sort of the engineering problem
Hmm.
solving, right? When you say the gen mess, right, the first step is to figure out what piece of the mess you want to be cleaning up, right, in your
Yeah.
context, in your, whether it's your business or your personal life, and then looking at your constraints and your resources. Let's jump to resources for a moment and just say that different generations bring different strengths to the table and bring different challenges and gaps to the table. And so if your
Hmm.
challenges and gaps are your constraints and your strengths are your resources, how do you pull those together to solve the problem you're trying to solve? So,
Hmm.
in a business context, if you're trying to, let's say, adopt AI,
Hmm.
you have boomers and Gen Xers that have a ton of experience in your domain, in your space, that know what are some of the key leverage points where if we could just change this, we're going to make a huge difference, right? They are much more likely to have that knowledge than someone who's new to the industry.
Hmm.
At the same time, the folks that are new to the industry also have, my Gen Zers have their entire lives of people asking them to think about the big picture and to think
Hmm.
about how they're going to step into these leadership roles. And so, how do you pull those together and say, we've got these like blue sky dreamers, a whole generation of them that we asked to bring this creativity to problem solving. We've got folks who know where the fulcrum point is
Hmm.
on those problems, right? How do we bring that together to solve, to make our business more effective? So, really
Yeah.
taking a step back and thinking about what everyone's bringing to the table, where are the limits, and how do we, use the strengths to compensate for them. That,
Hmm.
that's what I'd love to see more companies
Yeah.
doing.
And it's interesting too, because what you're really talking and speaking to is this idea of, instead of just sort of seeing it like, the generations aren't getting along, it's a mess, or, um, oh, let's just have someone come in and give us a talk. And then now we all know it's a mess, or we know it's not great. And these are these 4 or 5 things that we can do. What you're really speaking to is, right, identifying, okay, what is the friction point? Like, what is the issue? Is it hiring? Is it retaining? Is it this, right? What is the problem?
Yeah,
And then working to that particular problem within your own, like, not trying to solve the world's problems, but your team, that, or your department, or however many people it's going to affect in that
exactly.
way. And that, I think, I love that, because it makes it so much easier to digest. Right, which is what you do. Thank you so much, Belle, for being here. This was utterly fascinating. I've learned more about engineer. I didn't understand this this way of thinking. I think in my mind, I always, because it was never a direction I would think that I would go into. And so I think of software engineers, coding, and then I think of um, civil engineers or people that are doing, and it's like, oh, isn't that more math? Right. But it really is, it's problem solving.
It's
It's
problem
problem
solving.
solving. I love that. Is there anything that you want to share or plug or?
Yeah, my LinkedIn newsletter is a Friction to Function newsletter. So just once a month. It's not a huge. I'm not going to be in your inbox every day, but I am and have been will be talking about how AI folds into our lives, the workplace, and then more broadly, how can organizations use this problem solving mindset to go from friction to function. So it's a great time to subscribe.
Awesome. And thank you so much. And thank you for being here, for listening to the Gen Mess with Tess. Remember, we're not just fixing the mess, we're learning how to live in it.